All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I almost said good morning because I think this is the very first time we've ever met in the afternoon. So a very special occasion to have you all here. We will go ahead and let Addie take roll for everybody. So I will just go on to the normal documents and we'll go through our normal approval process. So beginning first on June 12th, asking you to reach back into your memories as well as into your documents. If you recall that we have already approved the meeting minutes for June 12th. So today I am here just to get approval for two documents. The first is the June 12th meeting recap for the intervention subcommittee. So intervention subcommittee members, you know who you are. Are there any changes or edits to the June 12th recap intervention subcommittee document? And I see no hands up or changes or edits. So if we could please have a motion and a second to approve that document, please. Again, intervention subcommittee.
Beth, I can motion to.
This is Norma. I second.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Norma. Is there anybody who is opposed to the approval of the June 12th recap intervention subcommittee notes? Okay, I see none. Now we're going to move on to the June 12th recap for the prevention subcommittee. Prevention subcommittee friends, are there any edits that you would like to see to this document? All right, seeing none, if we could again have a motion and a second to approve that document.
I motion to approve that document.
And who said that for me, please?
Lynette.
Thank you, Lynette.
This is Jenna Coleman. I can second.
Thank you, Jenna. Is there any opposition to the approval of the June 12th meeting recap for the prevention subcommittee? All right, it looks like that also will be approved. Now I am moving us to July 31st meeting minutes. Again, this is also in your packet. Are there any changes or edits that the group would like to see to those meeting minutes of July 31? All right, I see no hands. If we could have a motion and a second to pass those meeting minutes, that would be terrific.
This is Ashley. I'll make the motion.
Thanks, Ashley.
Beth, I can second.
Thank you, Beth. All right, is there anybody who opposes the approval of the document July 31st meeting minutes? Okay, seeing none, that document will be approved. And finally, also on July 31st, you received a meeting recap in your packet. It's a pretty brief one. Are there any additions or edits that need to be made to that document? Okay, seeing none, if we could again have a motion and a second to pass the July 31st meeting recap.
This is Ashley. I can make the motion again.
Thank you, Ashley. We could have a second, please.
Elizabeth, I'll second.
Thank you, Elizabeth. All right. Is there anybody opposed to the approval of the July 31st meeting recap? All right. I see none. So those documents will all pass. And thank you. Good, Trace.
All right. Well, yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate y'all coming back so quickly, and we'll be back again next Wednesday, potentially as well, for another meeting should we need that time. So just want to talk process real quick, and then we'll get into the content. I know there's a couple people on the call that weren't able to join last meeting. So just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So we're on the second part of our draft recommendations where we're soliciting feedback from you all. So in the last meeting last week, we reviewed 1 through 4. Today, we're going to be reviewing 5 through 7. And then We are going to send out a survey after, or I should call it a form, a feedback form, where once we take all the edits provided in the last meeting and this meeting, we'll then, make any edits as needed, and we'll send out a final Google form for everyone to be able to review and provide feedback there. And so and then from there in September, we'll be reviewing a final set of recommendations, or sorry, in September, we'll be reviewing the vote on the final recommendations. So, so I just want to be clear that today we're just doing the second half of the recommendations, and you will have time via that form to actually give feedback to all 7 of them. So if you missed last meeting, no worries there. You just missed kind of the discussion where we were able to bat around, but you will still have that opportunity for feedback. The other thing that we noted in the last meeting that's just a process on our side, on Keystone side, is if you are intending to abstain from voting for any particular reason, we do need a letter on letterhead from whatever entity you represent, even if that's, I know some folks are representing self, but if you represent any sort of specific entity on that letterhead, and also just noting what your place is on the task force. So everyone has a different kind of role they were slotted into. And if you need that technical role, Jordan and I can provide that. So just send me a note and we can get that to you. So that's just if anyone is planning on abstaining from voting, and then we'll put that as an addendum to the report so that folks are clear on who voted and who didn't when we release the recommendations. Any questions there on process before I move us into our second set of recommendations? Actually, sorry, the other thing I'll say is, again, we're going to send out a Google form where you can let edits to 1 through 7 for us to for things to be considered, and then we'll also be voting via form, which will be a separate form. So that's all going to be, once we have a chance to make any edits from all the different opportunities folks have had to provide feedback, we'll then say, all right, here are the final recommendations, and your voting is on that. And so if you vote no, for instance, so I want to make really clear that the first form is about edits, where you can say, hey, I'd like to see this or this language here, etc. The second form on voting is if you're voting no on something, that you can just provide feedback, and those comments will be provided as an addendum to the report as well. So all those comments will be captured as just kind of a package on each individual recommendation. So Jordan, I hope that's maybe clarify if I'm botching anything as far as process goes, but I just want to make sure folks were clear. Renee, I saw your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a question, just especially so we can kind of relay back to our organizations. When you say that you need a letter if the vote's going to be an abstention, can you say a little bit more about what that means, like needing a letter?
Yeah. So it's just it's a letter on letterhead from you. So it's not like you don't need it from like your organization. It'd be from you saying, like Dr. Marquette, I represented X on the task force. My assignment was X role. So Jordan, I'm looking at you because I'm like forgetting the actual roles.
No
but
worries.
as an example, I was assigned X role and I'm abstaining from voting, and this is why. Right. So just an abstention of if there's like a conflict of interest or whatever reason that you have for abstention, just to name that. And then that will be provided as an addendum, like an actual appendix item on the report. So that if I'm a legislator and I see like, oh, all these people were on this task force and I'm looking at these votes, I also know like who did and did not vote, just so that it's clear. So
Okay, yeah, so that helps clarify the content. I guess part of my question too is when you say it's needed, just again, so we can communicate back accurately to our organization, like the need is based on, just because I'm not familiar with that being part of the process. So when you say that's needed, could you say a little bit more about how you're defining that need, or what that need comes from?
Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in, Trace, if that's helpful
Sure.
at all.
Yeah, well, and
Yeah.
I can also jump. We do this on all of our
Yeah.
with Keystone. So you can say from your side, Jordan, I'm also happy to provide that context as well.
Yeah, you go ahead and wrap up, Trace, and then I'll just kind of let know on our process side why we need it.
Yeah. So for us, if there is a full abstention from voting, it'd be one thing if like you abstain on one particular recommendation, for instance. but that would just be like a note. But if you're fully abstaining from voting, it's just that when we submit a report to say like, here's the group that worked on this and here's what this group said, we want to say with full integrity that, well, this person actually didn't vote on these things. And so you should know that, because we don't want you to get looped. If 7 recommendations pass and you didn't vote on those, either yes or no, we don't want people to be like looped in thinking that these voices were represented on X items. So that's the context. And that's just something that we do kind of broadly, because again, across different task forces, different people abstain for different reasons. So that's the process on our side. Jordan, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, in terms of recording the vote, that will be recorded by position and by individual in the final report. So what I don't want to put down is, if you're abstaining, I don't want to put down that you just didn't vote. And this way, like if you're abstaining, I'll include the letter in full in the report. So the reasoning for the abstention is really clear. And that just kind of ensures that the report demonstrates we weren't excluding people from voting, that we gave full opportunity to vote, and that there's a record of why the vote was not taken. That's just really important on our end on the CPO to show process transparency, because we do not want to have the impression that we were excluding people from a vote, or that we're representing you when we shouldn't be.
Got it. Okay, thanks for the explanation.
Yeah, and Renee, if there's anything else you need on that, just let me know. Happy to provide there. David, Lee, go ahead. Good to see you. Also, thanks for your Kauai note, by the way. I had an excellent time. I'm no longer there, but it was fun.
Yeah, it's a great time and a great place.
Yeah.
So, quick question. I mean, just going through some of the things you just said. You talked about we're going to go through 5 through 7 today.
Yep.
Then we're going to send out a Google Sheet /survey.
Yep.
To gain more feedback on the recommendation. And then you're going to send out another Google form or survey for the vote, because you also said in September we're going to vote. So which one is it? Is it both or one or the other?
No. So you're gonna, I appreciate that. I'm like, okay, good clarification. So we're gonna be voting via form. The September meeting will just be to review and to just kind of wrap
review
up
the vote.
Yeah, exactly. So to review and sort of wrap things up, but because different people are available or not available, we've just kind of found that it's better to do the vote and have folks have the opportunity to do the writing, particularly of their why. So if someone votes no, for instance, giving them the opportunity to provide comment, that sort of thing. So that's why the vote is going to be via form, and then we can follow up individually.
Do you have a timeline on how far apart those will be?
Yeah, so we're going to be writing. So after today, we're going to go back and do the writing with the edits, right? And so we've got, I do know that the deadline for the voting is August 29th. So I would imagine we'd have next week, we'd be getting back to you the edits. And then the following week, you'd be receiving the final recommendations. And then the following week would be when those votes are due. Jordan, do you have is that timeline sound right to you? So you'd basically have like 1 week on each of those edits. So 1 week of the final edits. And again, like for folks that have participated in both meetings, you're providing these comments and those are the form of edits, but we just want to make sure that folks have the opportunity for any further written edits, and particularly for folks that weren't attending the meetings. So you might feel like you were able to give all your feedback, David, in like the last meeting and this meeting, and those edits were incorporated and you feel good about that, and that feels good. But if you're like, hey, I got some more things I want to kind of spell out as it relates to the edits I'm seeing, because what folks are going to see in this next survey is the product of our edits after these last 2 meetings, right? So you're going to be able to see, like, did they capture my edits, my thoughts here, or do I still have more things to say? Does that make sense?
It
Cool.
does, Trace. When are we going to get it for those of us that have bosses that we need to run it by and such? I know when it's due, but like, when are we going to get it so that we can vet it internally?
Yeah, Jordan, I don't want to overpromise, so.
You guys will have the first round of voting. We're going to do on Mondays. So you can anticipate the kind of revisions in that first round by this Monday, so you can see it, and then we'll send out the following Monday. I know that we're asking for somewhat tight turnarounds. We do acknowledge that. However, like a lot of these shouldn't be too new because we spent so much time in them before. So I just kind of want to settle fears that you're going to see something brand new compared to what we've talked about in the last two meetings. When Trace is talking about making revisions, we're massaging things, we're putting them into that context. But unless in this meeting we decide to go a completely different route, everything that you're getting in these final Google Forms will be very, very familiar. So based on the materials that we even shared last week and that we're going to share this week that will go into the folder, you can start disseminating those among your bosses and management teams as well.
Cool. Any other questions there? And we'll put this, I'll follow up via email after this so that we are all on the same page of like, here's when you'll receive this. Those are, I think it'll be super clear from there. Jordan, anything else, or Stephanie on y'all's end? Okay, cool.
Trace, this is Norma. I just want to make sure that, did you guys see what I wrote in the chat? I just want to make sure you guys saw that.
Yes,
Right.
I was actually just gonna respond and then I didn't push enter, but no worries at all. And Norma, you're a great example of why we were hoping those surveys are helpful. So for someone that's not able to participate in the way that they want today, there's also going to be written opportunity to give that feedback. So
Awesome.
yeah, no worries at all. And thanks for being here. Hope drive safe.
Thank you. Yeah, I
Yeah.
just got to Zavio, so I just wanted to let you guys know though. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, thanks. All right, anybody else on process, questions, etc.? I really appreciate that. And of course, you can always send a note before we keep going. All right, cool. Okay, so we're going to do similar, actually the exact same format as we did last meeting, which was we're going to go recommendation by recommendation. So again, we went through 1 through 4. You saw those in the recap, and you'll see our edits once we send out everything next week. Today, we're going to go 5, 6, 7. We're going to go one by one. We'll give you an opportunity to sit with these recommendations individually. I want to have Jordan give some context for each one. I think that was helpful last week. And then we'll send you off for about, 10 minutes or whatever needed for the time to kind of read through it and gather thoughts. And then we'll open it up for discussion. Once we feel like we're in a good spot there, we'll move to recommendation 6 and then recommendation 7. So we've got 2 hours today to get through these 3 recommendations versus the 4 we had last week. So Ashley, I'll drop in that link here in a bit, the 1 through 4. But I want to go ahead and Jordan, I'm going to drop in recommendation 5. And before we send folks off, if you want to provide kind of any just high level context for folks before they dig in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Trace. And just to step even one further back, because I know we have some folks who weren't on the call last time. These recommendations have been drafted after reviewing every recording, every recap, every document that we've had in place. So they truly are an attempt to incorporate the discussions that we've had as a group, to reflect where we hit some majority points, and really try to capture the very diverse discussions that we had as a task force. So I just want to emphasize that this is not us kind of grabbing out of our bag, but this is truly reflective of what we saw in the discussions and what we heard as repeating themes. And one of the biggest themes that we saw kind of coming through again that I just want to stress is the need to build those systems, the frameworks, the processes that this group kept identifying as current gaps. So for example, data collection, standard data collection processes and forms, information sharing, the ability to extract data, all those things that we heard again and again and again as I wish we had this, I wish we had better information on that. So you'll see that reflected again today in some of these recommendations. I want to stress again, this is not us kicking the can down the road. As drafted, the recommendations are intended to note the need, put into place a very smart process for a thoughtful development of these processes, and then require the use of these processes. So we've tried to come at them from a multi-tier kind of approach. Today, we do have one that is less of a kind of look forward and an invitation into that kind of third-party consultant, higher institute of education that you see in some of the other recommendations, and we're going to address that one first. But that's been the process for developing these recommendations. And I just wanted to open up to questions to that for anyone who maybe wasn't on the call last week.
Yeah, and just real quick, the 1 through 4, Ashley, is what you just requested that I just put in the chat, but that's not what we need to be reviewing. right now for today. So the link before that, where it says recommendation 5, that's what we're going to be talking about.
And so Trace, I think you put one through. Yeah, so recommendation 5 is up. As a note for today, we are not reviewing recommendation 8. That's done intentionally because recommendation requests that this task force identify resources needed. Instead of doing that in one bulk recommendation, we've done that throughout. So you'll see that in every recommendation we're putting forward right now, we're requesting adequate funds for whatever is coming through. So moving into 5. 5 is probably one of the areas we spent the most discussion on, and it addresses really 4 large points. One is physical restraints, the use of physical restraints and preventing children and youth from running away from care. 2 was the creation or consideration of a good faith provision. You can see that this recommendation addresses facilities specifically. So there was a request by a number of our stakeholders to consider a good faith provision in staff and providers at facilities, and considering, hey, we need discretion and ability to make these decisions. We need guidance on these decisions. We need clarity, but we also need, some understanding of some protection for us to do so. Next, in this arena was the need for parents to be informed. We heard from, Elizabeth and Kevin and then others on the call of the desire for more information when a child or youth enters a specific facility regarding their policies in terms of use of restraint and seclusion for runaway behavior. So we've attempted to address that as well. And then because of the nature of this directive, we have incorporated the temporary placement discussion that you'll see here. So I'm going to go quickly through some context on each of these so you have it as you're reading. In terms of the current statute, regarding the use of physical restraint and seclusion to prevent children and youth from running away from care, we took that poll, and if you'll remember, the majority of the poll found that the statute is not adequate and not providing people the clarity they need on when physical restraints may be used. We had discussions around the term imminent, which you'll see addressed in here. But that effectively, even in our discussions of the task force, there's multiple interpretations of how to use this, what qualifies as that emergency, when can we come in? And then this was really kind of one of those places where we were working to kind of work through those anecdotes we've had for several years, how one entity may be interpreting this, what we see in the media, and providing clarity in statute. So the first way we attempted to do this, and I know Brandon's not on the call today, but Brandon provided a lot of research in terms of case law in the area of what imminent means in Colorado case law, as well as potentially what the duty to intervene could entail. We did get stuck. We had a very robust conversation as to the definition of emergency that you see there in the recommendation. What is imminent? Is it the risk of, I think there was an example used of heading into a field where there may be rattlesnakes present. That's not an imminent risk. And the fact that risk is not used in that language at all. So we've tried to incorporate in this recommendation, I worked with Brandon on this one, what current case law in Colorado is really looking at. It is a broader definition of the term imminent. You'll see that we've expanded that scope here. And that's how we came up with the draft language. In terms of duty to intervene, we heard a very strong message from our provider members that there is needed clarity on what's their responsibility when they know that there is a history of a child or youth running away, when they know that stepping off the campus actually poses a very substantial risk, either for self-harm, harm to others, and what is their duty to intervene or engage the youth to stop that? That's not currently addressed, and we heard from multiple providers that it's not clear. It puts them in a position really effectively where they have to do a very quick analysis on can we do this or not, and more often than not, we're choosing not to, which has left, I know when speaking with Brandon, concerns that we failed to intervene in a situation that we know is going to be harmful or dangerous for that child or youth. So we've attempted to incorporate that. That plays directly into the recommendations that you'll see we've worked.
Take care of something in here, but we can
Sorry,
stop.
I'm just gonna, thank you. Into the criteria screening we talked about last time, as well as the pre-admission tool that we're going to talk about under recommendation 6. So just keep in mind that all of these things build at each other. Next, to build into that is the notion of the good faith. So one of the things that providers talked a lot about, if you go back and listen to the recordings, is hey, we need clarification on what our duty and our responsibility is here, but we also need some protection as providers, that if we're making the choice, we're doing it in best faith, that we have some protection under the law. So you'll see that's an attempt to work through that. The next recommendation that you have is an attempt to, again, create that requirement that parents or caregivers of children and youth in these placements are informed of the policies in regarding restraint and seclusion, so that they can make better informed decisions about placement. And then the third is temporary placements. So we did a lot of work on temporary placements. You guys had a lot of really strong questions, and we still kind of got caught up in that discussion of what can we do in terms of what the federal law will allow for homeless youth shelters in correlation to children who are under the care of child welfare services. So instead of doing a pilot program like you see elsewhere, we started in the position of let's test the viability of this and how can we potentially develop something that would meet the needs that this group identified in ways that would be congruent with federal and state law. So that's additional context. I'm happy to come back offline after you guys are done reading and provide more frameworks. And Trace, I know that we're going to give some reading time. So
Great. Any quick questions just on that context provided before we give you some time to do reading? All right, great. Okay, so this one is a little lengthy. So I'd say, well, not too bad. Let's do 10 minutes, but go off video, and then if you're ready to talk, maybe just come back on video. And if folks finish earlier, then we're ready to roll. I'll just make note of that. Cool. Otherwise, we'll be coming back at 1:41. All right, we'll give it one more minute. All right, let's jump in. This is a big one. Like Jordan said, we spent a lot of time on this. This came up in a variety of ways over the course of the task force's work. So just curious, I'd love to hear from folks. Anybody feel free to kick us off. What worked for you? Either what do you like? What do you see in there that you feel like yes, or what questions do you have or points you'd like to make? Jump in. Go ahead, Dennis.
This duty to intervene makes it looks like it would be a requirement to physically intervene. And so I'd be interested to hear from Becky what Kafka would think about that, because Kafka represents facilities that have policies where they don't restrain. They don't restrain and they don't seclude. So I don't know if that's the intent that requires a restraint. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, well, first, real quick, Jordan, is that the on intent side? Just want to make sure that we're, and then Becky would love to hear from you.
It's not the intent. It's not necessarily that it requires restraint, but that that they may be used in this context. So if it's the duty to intervene requires restraint or seclusion, that they have the ability to do that, but it was not intended to create a requirement for the use of a physical restraint.
Can you hear me? This is Becky.
Yeah, we can hear you, Becky.
Okay, thank you. I would agree. Dennis is right. There are some facilities that, as a policy, don't restrain. So, we would want to be certain that the wording is such that it's not a requirement. But it sounds like that's not the intent. So I think, did Brandon weigh in on that at all?
I'm curious, like Dennis, is there, or Jordan, maybe are there additional language suggestions or?
Very open to that. Brandon reviewed this to answer your question, Becky. So he did see it and approve it before we put it here, but absolutely open to suggestions on how to clarify the language.
My suggestion would be just adding a sentence saying nothing about this provision requires a provider to physically intervene in these situations, something like that.
Yeah, just to clarify our statement. Okay, thanks, Dennis. Appreciate that. Renee and then Ashley.
Yeah, just to help orient me, and I'm sorry if this is clearly stated somewhere and I'm just missing it, but is this a particular facility types that this language applies to, the statutory language? I mean, it's kind of tagging along to the same issue that was just raised, but I'm curious if what facility types would be addressing.
No problem. I don't think that when Brandon was writing it, it got down to that. I do think it was more focused on residential care as opposed to like foster care.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. And so I'm just wondering if that would have to be just, I think, really.
That was the intention, is that this isn't encouraging like foster parents.
Right.
But it was more on that residential in terms of being responsive to the directive.
Mm-hmm.
I think I need to clarify here that where you're going into statute would be any restraint and any seclusion, including in hospitals and in the adult world. So this is just universal restraint that your wording is going to apply to.
That's where the statute's from, Dennis. It's a universal seclusion and restraint statute. Okay. Yeah, I think that's really relevant and probably needs to be thought through quite a bit then, because this would be changing it for any setting. For Dennis, just for kids or for adults too?
Yep, adults as well.
Adults too. Yeah, okay. So that would be enormous.
Great, thank you.
So I'll just stick with that section since we jumped right there. Oh, sorry, was there somebody else trying to talk? Do you guys have some kind of weird lag, or is it just my side? Okay. So I'll just stick with that section since that's where you guys are. I'm struggling to understand the purpose. I know you said the purpose, Jordan, but then when I went to read it, I got lost in it because, this is saying originally that you may only use restraint or seclusion in cases of emergency after the failure of less restrictive alternatives, or if those alternatives are inappropriate. Now you're saying you can do it in an emergency after the failure of less restrictive alternatives, or if you're a provider who has a duty of custodial care, if you know the propensity and failing to intervene will allow or increase a likelihood of harm. And I just think you're making it really broad and even more discretionary. And I thought the intent was to provide providers with like factors that are a little bit more concrete so they know when to act. I might be misunderstanding the purpose, but to me, I'm not sure this does it. And I hate just saying this doesn't do it. But I don't have, like, a language didn't come to mind immediately. I'll try to work on some to be more helpful, but I actually think this might cause more problems than it solves, just given what I thought the purpose was. And maybe the purpose, like I said, I misunderstood.
No, that's really helpful, Ashley. Thank you. Again, it was intended to be more narrow. It's just a first pass. It really was intended to answer that question that I heard from Brandon and other providers is, if I know I do nothing and I allow this child to walk off the facility and I know their history, what is my responsibility to stop them for the best intentions of their care? So if it's in the wrong place, happy to move it, looking for language. That was the intention. Certainly don't want to open it up to, create more problems. So glad that's why that's here. So really happy to hear more language and placement options. But that's the intention that I heard from Brendan and other folks is, if I know this child or youth is about to walk off, and that them walking off actually is going to create a significant risk of danger or harm to them, what's my duty to stop them?
So I know we've got a number of folks kind of in the queue for comments. I think we can kind of come back around this idea, Ashley. And again, we could take a stab based on that feedback and ideas. I'm thinking Jordan, and then, more explicit feedback again in the next forum survey. Kelly, you're up next, and then Kevin.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify on what type of placements would be able to utilize restraints and seclusion. If it's a placement that has justice involved youth, and depending on why they're placed there, there's federal rules around being in a locked space or environment. So if there is a youth on delinquency court ordered from that court to be placed, depending on the reasons why or the type of facility, there's a whole reporting component to the Division of Criminal Justice and rules that need to be followed with that. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. If you're just going to make a overall statement that any placement can use those interventions, that those pieces need to go in place with it.
And you're saying like as a specific call out in that situation.
Correct. Or, whenever they're classifying or doing licensing of facilities or placements, that's going to have to be a consideration on what population is being served and why.
Thanks, Kelly. Kevin, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, my thought is that you're writing something that's broad that applies to various facilities with different licensing requirements and capabilities. So why don't we say that they need to act within their capabilities and licensing of the facility? I mean, that's not perfect language, but that's kind of the approach that I would take. That they need to act, they can't do nothing, but they need to act within their licensing and capabilities.
Appreciate that, Kevin. So just like inclusive language, recognizing those like differentiation factors of the different facilities. Yeah. Elizabeth?
So I get that Brandon was saying we need to offer them, need to offer facilities, more discretion on when to act, and I agree with that. But I thought that we were going to, the part of that criteria that we were going over, considering people high risk, I thought we were specifying that they had to meet some of those criteria before they could act. So this does seem really broad. And I don't know how we would incorporate that into the language. That's all I have.
And you're right, Elizabeth. So this really was intended to use those criteria. And so in some ways, I think what Brandon was trying to help us get at is if we're incorporating those standard criteria that we talked about last time, the pre-screening tool that we talked about last time, and that those result in situations where we know that this risk level is high and we're implementing this standard protocol, what do we need to put in terms of the statute to support providers in doing that? So you're absolutely right. We're trying to draw the thread here. It's just proving to be a little bit trickier, but I don't know if that helps answer your question.
So somehow it needs to be clear, right, before we go changing statute, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Elizabeth. Lynette, and then Ashley, and then Renee.
I was gonna say on this part, maybe what we need to do is not mess with hospitals at all. With changing and the use of restraints and the duty to. Could we specify these are for RCCFs, QRTPs, and I don't know what PRTFs fall under as licensing. Are they considered a hospital under those guidelines, or are they still considered under residential child program? But if they count for us, not the hospitals, then they should also be included on that. I don't think that we should have this in group homes or in foster homes. In licensed facility placements, the staff go through the training, and there is specific training to be able to engage in those types of interventions. And that includes the de-escalation training and all the other methods to engage a child to prevent them from leaving a facility or engaging in self-harm or harming others' behaviors.
Yeah, and Lynette, I also feel like I recall with the conversation where we had the meeting solely around like foster placements, et cetera, and how that might differentiate from some of these recommendations. Jordan, there might be an opportunity with this particular one of like where this applies, and then what considerations would be made from the group given the foster or like kin provider care piece, and a specific call out there. And I think if we look back at that recording, there would be specific language to pull from there. Is that, Lynette, is that kind of what you're? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that would be a perfect example as to why we did that meeting. We know that like it's not a blanket piece there. Ashley, and then Renee.
Yeah, in looking at this and just hearing everybody talk, I think one of the issues with this language, one, we're looking at it in a silo without the rest of the language, which is always difficult. But the way this makes it seem is that, the facility wants some factors on when to act. So to the point of whoever spoke before me, sorry, I can't remember who went. You want them to not act. But by putting this language in here like this, it seems like the only action to take is physical restraint, which is not, at least what my hope is, going to be. And so I think the placement of this, you can't look at this in a vacuum without the other recommendations, I think, of other ways to act. Otherwise, it seems like the only action is physical restraint. And I don't think that's the message we want to send. Like this, the factors need to be with the other recommendations of that I think we have coming up. So part of it may just be looking at this in a silo that's causing such heartburn, at least for me.
Yeah, I think that I'll just jump in and say, like, I think that context is super important, right? That the values of this group have been really loud and clear from the get-go, which is physical restraint is not the right. Like, I think we've captured that in the narrative piece more. And that these are the recommendations to like clarify on those pieces. So Ashley, I know it's hard to like zone in while you're kind of like, well, did we forget all those other context pieces? And the point on that would be no, but Jordan or Stephanie want to make sure y'all have an opportunity to speak to that. But I think, I do think that that's the narrative piece that's helpful to just remind folks of.
It is, and just to stress, it is a very consistent thread that we draw through the narrative of the in-depth conversation we had here regarding physical restraints, trauma-informed care, evidence-based care. So that's all in there. But you're right, Ashley, like these are kind of compartmentalized and they're hard to build on each other. So again, really open to language anyone may want to throw in the chat to kind of help guide us. That would be very helpful as well.
Renee, did you still want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know that I have anything to add at this point after the last couple comments. I guess I'm just still really trying to grapple my mind with now with it being clarified that the statute is for all SNR for every setting in the state. It doesn't really seem even kind of workable to have some of these inclusions. Like you can't talk about a provider and a child if this is a statute that is applying everywhere and wouldn't be able to factor in the risk stratification and all of those things. So, I mean, this, just kind of capturing what was just said, but I guess my brain is kind of grappling with, well, then, do you have alternatives that were thought of in terms of it's not applying to the whole statute? Where that would go, or if the desire would be to have it still, the definition part of it, clarifying imminent apply to the whole statute and put some of these other things somewhere else. Just it doesn't seem like pursuing, I guess, some of these things under this statute is even feasible with that being clarified, I guess.
Jordan, anything else? Renee, appreciate that. And I think that's, again, like, I mean, these conversations and feedback here are also like, will be included also in the narrative piece. So like this, here are the recommendations and here are the questions and the concerns that folks had surrounding these and the nuances and whatnot. So appreciate those comments and call outs there. Jordan, anything on your end?
Just another plea, again, because this one is so specific, I'm really looking to anyone on this group who can provide language for a different location. That's helpful for us in redrafting. So if someone is willing to do that or, do that in the interim, that's helpful for us so that we're not kind of cycling in where the places where maybe we shouldn't be. So any feedback in writing that people can get to us between now and when we send these out is helpful.
Great. Anything else on this particular recommendation, feedback, or thoughts that you want to make sure that we're capturing? Dennis, go ahead.
I won't get on board with broadening the language around restraint outside of the use of imminent threat to bodily harm or to others. So I can't get on board with this. Its restraints are not a harm-free intervention, and I don't want to see them used more broadly.
Dennis, can you or sorry, go ahead, Stephanie, jump in.
Yeah, I appreciate this discussion. And its nuances. I want to take us back for a moment and get us out of sort of the placement of where this language currently sits and get back to the conversation that this subcommittee had regarding facilities wanting an acknowledgement that they have a duty to act on behalf of the children in their care. That was the conversation. And the conversation came from, and I always call it folklore. There's a lot of that in our business. That they basically were like, well, this thing that has cropped up, like we can never touch kids, right? Those sort of extreme examples, like we can never touch kids. We have to let them run. And those are statements that have been made for years. And then, of course, the opposite side of people going, no, you can restrain kids if it meets the definition of imminent and emergency. So that was the discussion. And so I guess what would be helpful, Trace, is to talk about this quote duty to intervene. Because I think that was the issue, right? Placement aside, restraints aside, actually, the conversation was facilities saying, I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that we do have a responsibility to keep children safe in our facilities. And I read the case law, and indeed, there's civil case law that talks about in hospital context and cases where people went, nope, hands off, I can't handle that. And then indeed hospitals or providers were sued. So I guess, can we raise the conversation up to get people's opinions on this notion of duty to intervene, period, without regard to intervening necessarily equals restraint. I appreciate that's the language that's in front of everybody, but I think this might be a little bit easier if we can take it one step higher than that. And I guess I'm curious about what people think about, quote, a duty to intervene to protect the children in your care. I just think I want to, can we do that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that particularly for the kind of the narrative around this one, but like you said, it's a higher level conversation that's been had, because I've got some quotes swirling already of things that folks have shared over the last, year and a half. So curious, what are folks' thoughts on this idea of what Stephanie's posing around this duty to intervene? What are your thoughts here? We zoom out a bit. Would love to hear from folks. Ashley, can you give some context both for your comment, because I think that kind of gets at,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah,
your
I mean,
thoughts
I'm just
on each
thinking
of
like,
these.
I know that, we're gonna have recommendations around like, when when you call it in, and if I think we're gonna go there with recommendations, when you call it in, if it's gonna be, an emergency or assigning a level, and then that has a different response, that calling it in is an action. Doing some of the assessments or whatever can be an action. Like if we end up with the group that's going to help track down runaways, which I don't know if we are or not, but that's an action. Like to me, that belongs in one section, and you have you have like a continuum of intervention, and they're all listed together, maybe in a new section of statute rather than one piece here, one piece there. And at the beginning of that section, you can put your simple sentence of, there is a duty to intervene in order to prevent blah, 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 blah. Here's your menu of services, so to speak. And it's all together in one. And then I think you're gonna see it as the continuum it's meant to be, and it will be easier to assess, and I think more clear for facilities.
Appreciate that, Ashley. So just kind of like, creating a more clear container as to which would kind of underscore the value piece of what you're saying around what this group has said all along of what their values are around keeping kids safe in different ways. Yeah, Dennis, jump in. And then Lynette, would love for you to.
Okay, so I have two thoughts here. One is that if you put in a duty to intervene, even if you put a disclaimer about that it doesn't require the intervention for other providers, I'm worried that opens up those providers up to more civil risk. If you're going to say some people have a duty to intervene, but others don't, I'm a little bit concerned about that. And then the other concern
Dennis,
I have about, go ahead.
Sorry, can I jump in and clarify? I just want to ask a question on that comment. This idea of a continuum of response, like Ashley is saying, does that help kind of the concern around that someone would see the duty as physical restraint versus the continuum piece? Would that kind of like help the concern there? I'm just making sure we're connecting if we were to kind of go down the suggested
My
trail.
concern would be that somebody would say, why did Third Way not intervene in this instance when Southern Peaks in a very similar instance did intervene physically? My other concern is if we put a duty to intervene in, and you have facilities that do restraints, those staff aren't going to take any chances. If there's any doubt in their mind, they're going straight to restraint. And that is not something that I can be okay with.
Appreciate your comments there, Dennis. And I want to come, yeah. And Ashley, I appreciate the brainstorming too, because I'm just trying to kind of tease out like what folks are, you know, what are the options and what are those specific concerns that folks are trying to spell out. Lynette and then Elizabeth. Lynette, I think you're on mute if you're talking.
I wasn't talking, I was typing. I was changing the wording of what I put over there in the caption. And I really went back to duty to intervene using a continuum of methods up to seclusion rooms or physical restraints if approved and employed by the facility per policy, when the child poses a severe threat to themselves, as defined up there, or others, and if the threat is imminent. And that again ties back to number 4 on the sheet. And so it was just an idea for how to word it, because I agree they shouldn't jump straight to restraints. I also don't believe that most facilities want to do that. I mean, they've avoided it for so long now that that is not their go-to anymore. And I agree, we don't want it to become the go-to. And maybe in this policy is that restraints get reviewed to make sure that they did follow that continuum. So that if a facility is overusing them, it can be addressed quicker instead of come back later. Because I think Dennis's concern is valid.
Yeah, so it sounds like just seeing like head nods around this continuum piece and how that might get at ensuring that that's not where folks are jumping to immediately. So I think that's something that we're just gonna have to workshop to see how that lands with you all via the kind of follow-up survey. But really appreciate that. And Lynette, really appreciate, I'm just sitting here, I'm like, I love when people can just spitball well-organized thinking. So thank you for taking a stab at that. Elizabeth, jump in and then we'll keep it going.
Okay, so just a couple of things. I know that we did talk about parents or guardians signing waivers of liability when they're placing children in facilities that are using restraints. I like Lynette's idea of when restraint is used, having it reviewed, probably every case, because right now I think Dennis said that his department only gets notification if there's an injury. Was that it, Dennis?
No, we get them all, but also providers are required to review all their restraints too.
Okay, so, but what I feel like is that, you know, I feel like Dennis is saying that he doesn't want his facilities to have any kind of requirement to keep kids safer than they're required to now, you know, just due to possible civil action. Is that?
No, I mean, restraint is not, I mean.
I'm not talking about just restraint. I'm talking about you're saying that you don't want any kind of language that says that they're required to have some kind of action, even if, like Lynette says, continuum of care, and even if we put up these different actions that they can take, you're flat out saying that you're not going to support any language like that. Is that right?
I'm flat out saying I'm not going to support any language that would broaden the ability of providers to do restraints. If there's going to be a duty to intervene in there, I have some concerns about like civil actions against our facilities. But what I'm saying I won't get behind is I won't support language that broadens the ability of providers to do restraints.
Well, that's fine. So, but in our other requirements, we're listing out certain criteria that shows kids are higher risk for higher levels of response. So therefore, that language in itself actually more clearly defines what imminent danger is. So even if we don't change the language, what we're doing with the recommendation saying that these kids are higher risk actually, to me, allows providers to make that call. So we do need to protect providers and allow them something that says, I'm not going to lose my license if I decide to use restraint and if it meets the imminent risk level that's already in the language.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I appreciate we're over here making notes on all the comments. I want to make sure I keep us moving along. So is there anything else, again, folks are going to have an opportunity to review edits that we'll make after today's conversation. So anything for the good of the group before I move us along to recommendation 6, and then you'll still be able to provide, again, feedback via the form. Anything else? All right. This is a sticky conversation, y'all, so I appreciate folks just kind of like sticking with it and staying at the table with us. Stephanie, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to confirm where we landed, for lack of a better word. So what I heard people say, first, and I think most importantly, and again, Dennis, I agree with you. We don't want to create circumstances that increase the use of restraint. So that's the fundamental principle. Let's start with that. Secondly, I guess what I'm hearing is that people are right with the notion of facilities have a right to intervene or duty to intervene, and that duty must be linked to the circumstances or criteria that we are contemplating in another recommendation, which is namely risk assessments or risk categories, as well as sort of protocols that are linked to those criteria. So in other words, the language here would go from being connected to restraints and emergencies and all of that, and instead it would be put in the recommendation of, and I'll just use, I think, Lynette's language or Ashley, but it would be connected instead with the development of those criteria and protocol responses. And so it could be as simple as, not a law, but just, we understand facilities have an obligation to intervene to keep children safe, and then let the criteria spell out what they spell out. And okay. And I'm getting head nods from Elizabeth and Ashley. Okay. I'm not sure I said it any much better, but I just want to confirm that we're not going to omit the language per se, but it does belong in a different place and in a different context. Is that okay? Yes, Dennis.
Even if you create criteria by which like some kids meet this criteria and then they can be restrained, you can't use that information. Statute prohibits the use it prohibits providers from putting into a treatment plan circumstances under which they will do restraints.
Sure, I understand that, but I don't think that's what we're talking about here.
Right, but you can't. Well, then what are we talking about? Because even if you create that criteria, the provider can't document the criteria.
The criteria, again, are listed, and as I recall, would be used in the context of a child runs, and then a list of criteria appears, and essentially providers would then have to look at it and say, oh, is this a child under the age of 9? Is this a child who has, substance use problems? In other words, they would ask themselves these criteria and then would decide whatever response might be appropriate. It wasn't a pre-treatment survey, if you will. At least the piece that I am talking about. It's guidance about how to prioritize runaways. Dennis, you're just looking at me.
I'm just trying to think it through, like what that looks like for a provider, but because like, how are they gonna? Okay. I mean, so their staff is going to make a determination at the time that of this checklist of things that the youth needs.
Well, again, I think that goes into these additional recommendations. So I think we have that conversation then, Dennis. I'll have it with you. I think for today, I just want to confirm that we are in agreement of moving potentially any duty to intervene to a different piece of our recommendations. All right, I'll take it in pieces. Thank you.
All right, y'all. For the sake of time, I'm going to move us along because, again, we will have opportunity to keep providing that feedback via survey. So recommendation 6, Jordan, let's shake that conversation and whiplash our way into recommendation 6. Curious, any context you want to provide before we send folks off to do some reading?
Correct. Just forgive me as I make a hard left turn because I'm kind of shifting from notes into context for a different conversation. Moving into recommendation 6, we've really focused on, again, I'm going to do 3 broad buckets that we found to be responsive to the directive. First was the conversations we had around physical infrastructure components of a facility, right? So we had conversations around delayed locks, fences, ankle monitors, all of those things. And then in addition to consideration of those physical infrastructure pieces, whether or not when placing a child or youth in a facility, we need to consider what a facility has in place or to notify parents of what a facility has in place and is that a good matchup, right? So this recommendation attempts to get at that discussion. The next big bucket we had was, and we've called it a pre-admission screening. I know that's probably not the right language, but for the continuity of this discussion, I kept it in place. But this goes back to what we were just discussing, which is this notion of upon admission, creating a standard assessment and a screening tool for children or youth to see what is their history, what can we pull down, and then utilizing those categories of risk that we talked about earlier last week, those standard categories of risk, then to develop this kind of response guidance and plan that we talked about. So I appreciate it gets a little bit out of order because different components of the plan we're trying to discuss respond to different directives that just fall out of place. So if I had to kind of map it out, it would be the group is proposing so far. We develop standard multi-tiered criteria for risk of running away. We utilize those criteria in a pre-admission or early admission screening tool, which is what the recommendation states here. Then based on the use of that tool on those criteria, we develop standard response protocols for the youth in a runaway situation. Does that layering make sense? They're distributed weirdly among the directives because they have to be responsive to the directives we're trying to put into place. Before next week, I think I might put together an infographic that might demonstrate some of this because I appreciate we're jumping around a little bit. But that is what that kind of middle recommendation you see is. And then also responsive to this directive were the components of education that we talked about. So what can be standard required education for providers and caregivers on the risks of running away, as well as standard education for children and youth themselves. And I'm sorry to bounce back one more time for that pre-admission tool. You'll see that incorporates using the framework that we discussed during our last meeting, that development of that standardized framework where everything should be going into this continuum of programming, I guess is what I'll say. And Trace, I'm not sure if I made that worse or better. Someone feel free to jump in and ask questions before you go to reading, because I don't want to leave people in a state of confusion.
Yeah, any quick questions on the context? All right, I'm going to shave off a few minutes, 7 minutes. If you need more time, that's fine. Just go off video. We'll come back at the 26th. Thanks, y'all. All right, let's go ahead and come on back. Everybody have enough time? We're good? All right, cool. Send me a note if you feel like we're moving on too fast. Let's jump in on recommendation 6. Thoughts, reactions, questions. What do you like? What concerns do you have? Anything you think is missing here? Ashley?
I just had one question about it. On 6A, funding the continued study of the infrastructure, I think maybe in context of all the other sort of funding studies where we're talking about more like comprehensive studies, evidence-based, third part, like universities helping out or whatever. It starts to sound like that's what you mean here. Like we want to have some broad study of like offense, which I don't think is actually what we want. And I wondered if the intent was study what's needed. Like each facility has different needs. Like, so maybe we just need to do a different phrase there, like survey or determine, what
Landscape
facility
analysis.
needs are, and then, fund it. Because I do think there was pretty broad consensus, at least in the meetings I was in, that some of this should be used. And this just sounds like we're going to say we're going to study whether it should be used, not study what's needed and then fund it. So I just think the wording might be slightly off, at least from what I thought we were kind of where we were going. Otherwise, I thought a lot of this recommendation made sense.
Yeah, I think you're matched on intent, so we can play with some other language of what might work better there. Appreciate that. Renee, and then Kelly.
Yeah, just regarding 6B, I mean, as I read it, I mean, it seems like it's kind of repeating what should be part of an assessment already. And I hate to have like additional kind of requirements be listed out if they're already part of what's being done. So I mean, when someone is being considered for a placement, the whole clinical picture and what their needs are is part of the assessment, and that's actually why some kids end up going out of state if they have needs for certain services, including a more secure setting. So yeah, so I just wonder if that's really adding much.
Yeah, Jordan, you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up and just ask, because obviously we don't want to be duplicative of what's already done, but is that specific part of an assessment required? Is it done informally? That's what we were kind of struggling with, because I think the intention was to get it standard.
I mean, there's nothing that specifically, I don't believe, Dennis, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's anything that specifically states you must look at the physical infrastructure of the placement that they're going to, but there's so many factors that go into it. And that is one of the things that is factored in. It just, I mean, if one were to list out everything that's considered, it just would be impossible. So calling that out specifically, when it feels to me like that's part of what the clinical thinking is to start with, that just feels it does feel a little bit duplicative to me. And anything clinical where someone starts to just highlight one thing outside of other things really just starts to kind of create problems in clinical assessments.
Thank you. So then I think, I'm so sorry, I just want to make sure I'm because I think the recommendation is to require it, and I just want to make sure it's that's clear to everyone, and just kind of trace if we could work through that's something we want to move forward with or not, because that was kind of how we worked through there, that this should be something that's required to be considered. And if that wasn't the intention, I just want to amend the draft.
Are you, sorry, Jordan, can you say that one more time? You want to ask the question, or I'm wondering if that's something that we can just like include as a one-off survey to ensure that we get everyone's.
I'm happy to do it in a survey. I just wanted to be clear, as drafted, it was intended to become a required 6. Sorry, I do not have my big monitor, everyone, I apologize. 6B. We
Mhm.
wrote 6B based on the conversation to require that be a consideration in determining placement. And I'm happy to do a survey. I just wanted to make sure there was clarity around the way it was written. And if I needed to adjust the language, the group had that knowledge.
Yeah, Renee, I'm curious with that context, is that, would you prefer to see that in like a survey to make sure that that context is correct?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if everyone taking the survey understands what all goes into an assessment and how decisions are made. To me, this feels unnecessary and problematic because a clinical assessment is supposed to be, the assessments should be matching the youth with, the best placement. And there's lots of things that go into there. So as soon as you start to put one aspect into, a requirement in a new way, again, it just sort of, it makes clinical assessments oftentimes just more unwieldy than better. Like there's lots of other very, very important things that are needed that aren't, necessarily, named out in rules and places, but they're part of a standard assessment. So to me, it feels unnecessary and potentially quite problematic because this should be, when people are matching someone, that is what goes into it. That's one of the things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We can circle up after this, Jordan, and clarify how we want to move forward on that. Renee, thanks for flagging that. We're gonna go Kelly, Lynette, Elizabeth, and then Stephanie.
Hey, I just wanted to point out again with 6A, by changing the physical infrastructure of a building or creating a secure perimeter around a building changes it to a secure placement. And so then there's federal rules that go along with that for the justice involved youth. That also includes when you secure the full building, then it creates an issue if you have youth who are offenders and youth who are not offenders in the same residential setting. So with our federal laws, you can't have those two populations mixed in a secure facility. So that creates issues of either having to have separate living spaces and programming, and defining why that youth is there, which gets a little sticky on, is it under their delinquency case, or is it because they need treatment services? And so how would we make that determination with those types of facilities?
Yeah, Kelly, I appreciate that. I know that that's something that we have, I think, been aligned on previously, of like that needing to be a priority that we ensure is spelled out and that we're aware of that. And I know you've raised that before, so appreciate that. Ashley, I see your point about the fencing versus secured perimeter piece, like that, just the call out of like super clear clarification of what we're referencing, because
if it's a fence and it locks and a youth can't just freely leave the property, then it's secure.
Kelly, just to jump in there, because I was going down this route for another reason at one point. This pertains only if the youth is placed by the juvenile justice for juvenile justice reasons, right? Youth can have a history and can be involved in the juvenile justice system, and like you said, placed for mental health reasons or other reasons. So, okay.
Yeah, if it's a placement as a result of their delinquency case, then they would be considered to be placed there as an offender. And I know we've had this conversation with DHS around locked facilities and how we would define that difference. So I think it would just, if this was to remain in there, then we would have to have those conversations of which types of placements can have secure perimeters, which ones can't, what type of kids can be referred there. If it's a DYS kid going for part of their commitment placement, that would be included as well. So it would just, yeah, it just makes it more complicated. And then it creates also reporting requirements to the Division of Criminal Justice once you lock down that building.
Gotcha. Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate the call out of like the scenario versus, seeing Stephanie's note about like we're not addressing juvenile justice facilities, but the difference of like a
Yeah, it's
individual.
just, if those kids
individual
are
thing.
in there, then
Yeah,
it triggers
how
all
do
the
we call
other.
that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's all part of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act and all
Okay.
the rules and requirements there.
Okay. So I think if we do like a specific call out, Jordan, kind of similar to earlier, where it's like there has to be a specific caveat call out that Kelly, we can work with you to ensure that that language is reflective of, these scenarios that you're referencing. Lynette, and Kelly, thank you. Appreciate that. Lynette, Elizabeth, and then Stephanie.
So two things. First, I'm going to go back to what I remember about our conversation about having fencing. Wasn't that it be a locked fence, but it minimized the places that a youth could actually take off from without staff seeing them, noticing them, and being able to intervene. Tomorrow, we are placing a youth with a low IQ, autism, and he is an eloper in a facility in Florida that has an 8-foot vinyl fence, so kids can't climb it. And their gate in Florida is one that you have to press a button and wait for it to open, and they have cameras there. So they have not had youth run away because they're able to get there if the youth is taking off. Plus, they have extra supervision for that type of developmental disability anyway. So I don't think that we thought about locking the gate like it's a prison or a jail, because that really is not appropriate for youth. But reducing the amount of area that they can actually abscond from gives the facility a better ability to intervene with that youth and try to prevent that runaway. That was my thought. The other thing that I wanted to bring up about this, this risk tool, I do believe, I don't want to add caseworkers more work either, but I do think it's important when we're placing in facilities. So I don't know that it's required for every child that we place. Maybe it should be required for every child that has a history of running away. I also don't want caseworkers to feel like they have to fill them out for 1-year-olds. Okay. And so I think that would address if they're going into a facility, a residential facility, I think that risk assessment tool should be part of that packet, that information, et cetera. Not necessarily into a foster home or a kinship home unless there's a history of running away. And then you could work through that with the providers. So that's my 2 cents worth, and kind of eliminate the all or nothing language. Thank you.
Was muted. Thank you, Lynette. Appreciate that. Elizabeth, did you have your hand up? Did I
Yeah.
just see that? Yeah, jump in.
Okay, so just I guess I'm wondering, Renee says that this is already included in clinical assessment, like who's doing these clinical assessments, because it certainly wasn't a factor when I was placing Timothy and working with well, what are they called? CCHS or the Community Healthcare Alliance was the person that was helping me place Timmy. And so, I mean, he had all kinds of clinical assessments but we were just waiting for an open bed. And it's kind of my understanding, of course, it's been 4 years, so it could have changed, but these kids that need placement are just waiting for any open bed in any facility that will take them. It's not like we get to pick and choose where our kids are going. So I think that they do need to do this risk assessment and pay a little bit more attention. And then, of course, like Lynette said, if we specify it's only going to facilities and not every single placement, that could minimize some of the overkill.
If I could just respond briefly to that, I think what you're saying is absolutely true, but it wouldn't be in terms of often it seems like and they are just waiting kind of for any open bed that meets whatever criteria. And I think that would be the same even if there was a specific call out that this one thing had to be factored in. The way I think about it, it is factored in, but if a match isn't found, and the same is true for, it might be recommended that a youth have specific treatment needs, but if a match isn't found for a placement that has that, you might send someone to what would be a less ideal match in order to not have them sit and wait for months or time or years. So I think it's less because it's not considered and more because there isn't just a plethora of spots for, youth in all the different places that might be, the most ideal for them.
Okay. I just think that, like in our situation, there weren't any options, like, so the facility knew that Timmy's high risk behavior was running and self-harm and suicidal ideation. So obviously, when I sent him there, based on their policies and procedures, that was nowhere near an ideal match. But neither the caseworker working with me or the facility said anything about that. They're just like, oh yeah, we have a bed, come on in, and
I appreciate that. I mean, in my opinion, my opinion, others may feel differently. My opinion, that has more to do with the not having, a plethora of matches than the fact that it's because it's not, those things aren't considered. But others may see it differently.
Appreciate that. Stephanie, I want you to jump in. Elizabeth and Renee, appreciate that. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Great. So first of all, always helpful conversation. And if I'm making a lot of faces, it's only because that's how I process information. So if you see my face scrunch up or something, that's how my face works. I think I just wanted to clarify with Renee. My understanding from the conversations is that indeed, when a youth enters into a facility, there is a pre-admission paperwork that is done. I thought what I heard, though, was that the pre-admission paperwork is different for each facility, potentially measures different factors or prioritizes things differently, and that the goal would be to create a more standardized admission regarding runaway behavior, including things like, so example, in my brain anyway, the way I used to hear this was, we have a child and this child runs. Great. And maybe one facility checks the box and says, yes, this child has run 5 times. But another facility says, because there's now, say, a standardized form, yes, the child has run 5 times. In each of those instances, the child went to an aunt's house. We now have the aunt's information. Like my understanding is facilities had different admission questions that ferreted out runaway behavior and the best way to address it should it arise. And I guess I'm looking for assistance from others who sat in on that group with me to confirm whether I heard that correctly. That was my understanding behind this recommendation, not that facilities didn't have pre-admission tools, because I agree with you, Renee. It was clear to us that that is a process.
So Stephanie, can I ask you to clarify, are you talking about 6B or are you talking about the risk assessment tool?
I'm sorry, I'm talking 6C.
Oh, yeah, and I wasn't referring to that. I was referring, to 6B, but I think Dennis would speak best too, because there is a move towards standardization, but that may not be addressing 6C anyway, but.
Okay, sorry, Renee. So it still goes though, if people have thoughts on, I guess, a 6C, I'm sorry, I feel like we're bouncing around a little bit here.
Stephanie, I don't know what the group said to you, but your assessment's correct, right? As to the current state of how providers do that. And
Okay.
Renee is also correct that we are looking to standardize that, and we are piloting a universal referral packet. So we're running into snags with that, but we have rolled out the pilot. So you're correct, and we are trying to go the direction you want us to go in.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Renee. I think I switched our apples and oranges here a little bit.
Anyone else want to jump in here with 6?
I was just gonna say, I think because of the lack of placement availability, caseworkers know that if they report that a youth has a history of running away, the chances of finding a placement are even slimmer. But the answer is not to bury that. The answer is to get everybody better at it. I think that's our intention as well. So supporting our providers in additional training and having them develop that continuum of intervention when a youth is running, and also engaging the caseworkers in some kind of an assessment that not only talks about when they've ran, but what's the reasoning to the best of their knowledge about why they ran, how they were triggered, where they went, and how were they found. Because I think that's the piece of information that doesn't get shared right now. It's in somebody's head. And so I think by not engaging in and being really clear that this is the type of tool we want, we're going to miss the boat. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynette. More than 2 cents. Anyone else? Renee, appreciate your suggestion as well in the chat. All right. I'm going to circle us back then to 5. Jordan had flagged, just specifically speaking, that we had a couple of things that we just wanted to double check. And I want to put it actually back in the chat to bring up. Give me 1 second. We've just got 10 minutes left, so I appreciate y'all hanging in with me. We'll see where we get on this one, and then we have the 14th to get through 7. So on recommendation 5, we didn't talk about good faith, parent disclosure, or temporary placement, which are at the end. So just want to call attention to those pieces. If you might not have specific call out or feedback there, but those are the 3 pieces kind of flagged that we didn't hear about or discuss. So just want to make sure we're not missing any broader feedback for edits, potential edits.
Just going back and looking at that, when I read it the first time, temporary placement for up to how long? Or as soon as if they can return to their original facility, great. So I think that was my only question about that is how long is temporary? Because we don't want them overused, but sometimes that might be the only safe place for a youth too, so.
Lynette, it's a great question. If I can just provide a little bit of context on how we got there. So as a group, we never really reached consensus or agreement on that question because we haven't gotten past this question of viability under federal and state law to begin with, which is why we've shifted that recommendation to let's take it in part and do iterations of the process. So it's not addressed specifically in the recommendation for that reason. If we wanted to refine those criteria that the subcommittee created, we could certainly include that. But again, we were just trying to get to, we haven't answered the question and we need someone to come in and answer the question for us on what it could look like and still be compliant, which I hope helps provide some context.
Yeah, I just wonder if that should be in part of the analysis is defining what is temporary, what would be the best use. I think that's where I would put it.
Great, I will work that in. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynette. Anyone else? And these 3 pieces, again, we might not have specific call outs, but we just wanted to make sure. All right. Great. Well, we've got 8 minutes left. So I want to go ahead and just introduce 7 since we're here. And I'm guessing we're going to need more time, but might as well see the language. So Jordan, would love for you to just kind of jump in with context as I share that, and then at least folks have it and we can come back from there.
Oops, sorry, I just wanted to pause on 6 for 1 second. So sorry. Did we hit everything on 6? Because we bounced around a little bit, and I know that we're bouncing just intentionally, but I wanted to come back to D, which are the standard training components. Renee, thank you for your suggestion on 6E regarding education and training. I just want to circle up and make sure we're not glossing over these things so it doesn't look as though we've not given people space and time to give feedback in this round.
So specifically 6D?
6D and 6E. One has to do with the training for providers and caregivers, and the other has to do with, and I agree, Renee, thank you, education for children and youth specifically.
Yeah, so going back to 6, so then we can just land on 6 today. That's totally fine. So 6D, 6E, Renee, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, it just occurred to me, someone made the comment earlier that like sort of some of these things not be appropriate for all youth. So if it's, something that's required, I have to go back and see the language. I can't see it right now, but yeah, just being mindful of, there's things you don't want to educate someone on if it's completely inappropriate for them or raise some topic, 3-year-old or whatever.
I'm just going to leave it open right now. Jump in.
I kind of like the suggestion that was in the chat, and I don't know who said it, so kudos to you. Instead of calling it training, call it education for both. Kids don't like to be trained either.
Appreciate that, Lynette. Thanks. Anyone else? Just a few minutes left. Again, we're focusing on 6D, 6E. Any particular feedback here? Okay. All right. Well, Jordan, go ahead.
I just had a process question when moving forward, Trace.
Yeah, go ahead.
Since we didn't get through 7, my question is, I can't send all the recommendations out on Monday because we haven't gone through all of them. So was curious if it's better to go 1 through 6 so folks can start providing feedback through 1 through 6 without 7, or would we prefer to wait so I can send you all the recommendations for feedback at once?
I think it makes sense to go ahead and send 1 through 6 because I think we just need more time, need as much time as possible, and then we can do 7. So that's what I would say. I don't know if the question was just, is it okay? And I want to go ahead and share 7 just because I do think it would be helpful for folks to go ahead and have that. And then can we just do the context piece, Jordan, right now for 7? And then we'll come back for the discussion, and then we'll go ahead though again and send. So it'll just be, again, multiple surveys, and I'll put this into the email, but 1 through 6. And then once we have the conversation around 7 will be retroactive to the others. So go ahead, Jordan, with 7, and then I'll drop it in the chat for now.
Thank you. Yeah. So context around 7, this actually ended up being one of our more narrow recommendations in terms of being responsive to the directive. And this is where we placed development of the standard statewide response unit. While we were researching this, they were called absconder units in other states. And as a group, we agreed that we did not like that name. And again, this would be an instance where we're asking a third-party consultant or an institution of higher education to come in and work this idea or this thought into, again, that continuation of programming. So if we're developing criteria that we use in a response tool, that we then put in standardized response protocols based on criteria, here's the unit that potentially at a centralized level we would ask to respond. A lot of the narrative that will be centered around this recommendation has to do with addressing the difference and how we can respond as law enforcement in terms of that urgency. This isn't meeting that criteria of a missing person, and creating a specialized unit to respond when we find ourselves in situations where youth or children have run away from care. We're not recommending a specific model, to be very clear. We're asking the third-party consultant to consider the different models, whether or not it's a multidisciplinary team that's located throughout the state. So by region potentially is another method, or we have centralized staff similar to the model we saw in Texas, is all addressed in the narrative. We're just asking for a broad consideration by a third-party consultant. And I just want to emphasize, because I think it's important to recognize the narrative ahead of this is very heavy on everyone's concerns that we want to be very thoughtful about increasing what feels like the presence of law enforcement, the disparate impact that that can have, the trauma that can have for youth. We discuss that at length, and it's covered in length as well in the narrative. So I just want to make sure that, because I know that's very important to everyone who discusses issue, it's covered in depth in the report.
Appreciate that, Jordan. As you consider this one, again, we'll come back on the 14th and have the discussion specifically around 7. Any questions, though, just clarifying questions that are last minute that you need answered before you head off with this language to consider? Okay. Cool. All right, y'all. Well, with that, really appreciate the discussion today. As Stephanie said, always helpful, enriching, thoughtful, and just really appreciate everyone staying at the table with us and kind of push-pulling on one another. Super helpful. So you will get a survey once we make edits to 1 through 6. We'll return next Wednesday for the meeting to discuss 7. So that'll just be its own separate thing. And then once we have all that together, we'll do drafting for final. And that is when you'll have the opportunity to do voting. And then in September, we'll come together and just have a discussion to review the results on that as well. All right. Reach out with any questions. Really appreciate y'all's time. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is typically later than we meet. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see y'all next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.